those of you who are just attending and not speaking, just some introductions. So I'm Jim Cooper. I'm an Associate Professor of History and American Studies at York St John University, and it's my great pleasure to be convening this roundtable about the 1984 presidential election. Obviously, it's 40 years since Reagan's big blowout, big massive landslide victory, and of course, all our attention recently has been on Harris-Trump. But now we can go back in time 40 years. We got some esteemed colleagues with us. We had an apology from Chris Campbell, who wasn't able to make it last minute due to a family emergency. So he sent his apologies. But we're still delighted to have Professor Andy Bush, Professor Diane Winston, Dr. Elizabeth Rees, Dr. Anthony Eames, and Professor Ewan Morgan with us today. My suggestion is that obviously attendees, you will already see everyone's biography and their expertise and so on the details of the events. No need to rehearse everything, but my suggestion is that Andy would speak first about say key moments of the campaign. Then we'll hear from Diane talk about religion, given her expertise on religion in media and politics in 1984. And then we'll hear from Elizabeth Rees talk about the East Wings, the First Lady Nancy Reagan, and then Anthony, when he's back on, he'll talk about Anglo-American dimension to it all, and then Professor Ewan Morgan, of course, our nation's top presidential scholar, will think about the legacy of 1984. So Anthony's back now. So Anthony, you'll be the penultimate speaker after Elizabeth, if that's okay, talking about Anglo-American dimension. Chris Campbell sends his apologies, Anthony. So in terms of the broader foreign policy aspects, I suppose we can bring that out in discussion. So if each of our speakers talk for about maybe 3-4 minutes, and then I'll try and think of some. I'm sure I'll probably have too many questions. We'll try to bring connections together between the topics to get a discussion going, and then towards the end we'll open up to any conversations from colleagues and students who are joining us in the chat and so on. Does that all sound okay? Yeah. So thank you all again for doing this. So without further ado, hand over to Professor Andy Bush of the University of Tennessee, who's written so widely on Reagan, among other things. So Andy, can't think of a better person than you to kick off, please.
Well, thank you very much, James. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be with you all. So some of the, what are some of the key moments? There were several of them, but a lot of them came before the campaign was fully underway. Or you could say the campaign between the two nominees was determined and going forward. And so I think actually two of the critical moments came in late 1982 and late 1983, long before the election in November of 1984. And those two moments were the point at which the economy began recovering from a deep recession, which a lot of economists point to that moment being around December of 1982, when some of the economic indicators really began to shift. And by 1984, that recovery was well underway, and it was non-inflationary, which was really important because Reagan's campaign in 1980 was built on, in large part trying to defeat inflation, but also unemployment. And so both of those figures were headed down, and they were headed down starting in late 82 or early 83. The other key moment prior to the election really was, in my view, the invasion of Grenada, which I know ruffled some feathers with Prime Minister Thatcher and others, but that was the point at which Reagan's approval rating actually went over 50% for the first time since late 1981. And the perception among most Americans was that it was a decisive action. It was really, I remember this. I was in high school at the time, so I was quite young. But it seemed to me like my first memory of foreign policy was the evacuation of Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War, and things had been basically a long string of retreats from that point on. And then Grenada was kind of a reversal of that. It was the first time in years that the United States had actually, in some sense, successfully taken the offensive against the what you might call the Soviet Empire, and that put Reagan into positive approval ratings for the first time in a long time. So those two things helped to set the stage for the election. There were other important points. Ted Kennedy, for example, deciding not to run for the Democratic nomination really opened up the Democratic nomination. There was a big fight between Walter Mondale and Gary Hart. Surprisingly, Gary Hart was a senator from Colorado, and he challenged Mondale on the basis of what he called new ideas. He thought Mondale was too tied to labor unions and the old Democratic Party, and Mondale turned back that challenge. One of the key points was a debate that they held in Illinois. The Illinois primary was coming up. It was a crucial primary, and there was a commercial being run at that time by the fast food restaurant chain Wendy's. Makes hamburgers, and the commercial consisted of these old ladies complaining about the other brands of hamburger, and one of them would always say, "Where's the beef?" And this has become a famous commercial in America. And Walter Mondale challenged Gary Hart with this in this debate, kind of laying bare the fact that a lot of this talk about new ideas was somewhat vacuous, or at least ill-defined. And Mondale said, "Where's the beef, Senator?" And a lot of people laughed, but it won. I think it won Mondale the debate and the primary, and he was on his way to the nomination. So that was an important moment. Mondale also wound up picking Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential running mate. That was the first time that there was a woman on a major party ticket in the United States. So that was an important point. But all of this was taking place in the context of the circumstances that were set by the economic recovery and by the perception that Reagan had restored American strength abroad. In the fall, there's not a lot of shifting, but probably the key moments came in the debates between Mondale and Reagan. In the first debate, Reagan faltered a little bit, started to show his age a bit. Mondale closed the gap just a little, and it seemed like maybe if Reagan didn't do well in the next debate, some people might be open to changing their minds about the race. Reagan came back and said famously, when he was asked about his age, he said, "I refuse to use my opponent's youth and inexperience against him as a campaign issue." And again, everybody laughed. Reagan won the debate, and that small challenge from Mondale was reversed, and those were really the key moments. I think a lot of what happens in these campaigns winds up being noise in some sense that is taking place in the context of what's happening in the country. That actually is the most important thing. So I think those two things that I noted at the beginning were probably the most important actual events.
Okay. Thank you, Andy. I've already written down some things already to ask yourself and others about, so that's brilliant. So on then to Diane, please, if you may, to given your expertise in religion, media, and US politics, and obviously wide experience in this, can you perhaps talk to us about the role of religion in the in 1984 in the election campaign?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
American politics underwent a sea change in 1976 when Jimmy Carter announced he was a born-again Christian. Most Americans had never heard that phrase before. Well, I should say many Americans had not heard that phrase before. And it subsequently energized Christian conservatives, Christian evangelicals who hadn't been a political bloc to realize their own strength. In 1980, Jerry Falwell began to organize this bloc behind Reagan. And in 1984, it really came into its own. In 1984, the religious right did everything it could to support Reagan in his bid for re-election. Tim LaHaye, he of Left Behind fame, started a group called Active, ACTV, which tried to organize religious conservatives for Reagan. And LaHaye claimed that 4.5 million Christian conservatives voted for Reagan in 1980, and he wanted to raise that number by 2.5 million. Religion quickly became part of the campaign because Reagan kept announcing his Democratic bona fides, and his opponents said things like, if Mondale is elected by 1988, there will be no freedom in America. I was struck about how familiar that sounds. In addition, Reagan himself brought up on many occasions that he felt that part of governing the country was setting a moral tone for its citizens and its agenda. One of the more important ways to gauge just how significant religion became was in the first debate. Diane Sawyer, the moderator, asked both candidates if they had been born again and what that meant to them. And both men had very diplomatic responses because neither wanted to upset their supporters and alienate others. But the very fact that Sawyer brought this up was important because, as I said earlier, just 8 years earlier, many Americans had never heard the term before. When the voting actually happened, and I just want to say one thing, religion came up time and again during the campaign. It came up in speeches, it came up in rallies, it came up as Mondale tried the best to explain his religious beliefs and kind of thread the needle between religion and politics, church and state. So it was something that voters saw in the media again and again. When the voting was actually done and Reagan did win by a landslide, polls showed that religion was not very important to the voters. In fact, most voters supported Mondale's views, but since Reagan had turned around the economy and he was perceived as a good leader, they voted for him. Most voters did not want religion to be part of the campaign, and most voters did not want a presidential agenda built around the social issues that the Republicans had been flagging during the campaign, which basically was prayer in school, an end to abortion, and tuition tax credits for parochial schools. So to me, the significance of religion in the '84 election was mostly perceptual because it became such a major part of this election, and it became, whipped up to the extent that American people were hearing probably as much about what they should do about abortion as they were about the economy. But in reality, it did not have real salience with the voters.
Thanks, John. Really, again, I'm scribbling stuff down just for me. This is fantastic. So moving on then. Obviously, Chris sends his apologies. So perhaps turn to Dr. Elizabeth Rees then from Southern Methodist University. Obviously, your specialism is in the East Wing. In terms of politics, so could you tell us a bit about Nancy Reagan, please, during the '84 election?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, yeah. So yeah, thanks, Jim, for the invite, and it's great to be here to talk about Nancy Reagan. Obviously, she is perhaps one of the best known first ladies alongside maybe Eleanor Roosevelt, certainly, and Jackie Kennedy, Hillary Clinton. So there's a lot to say about her, but I'm going to try and keep it brief by condensing this down to 5 key points, which I will run through as quick as I can without gabbling. So the first point that I kind of wanted to talk about was the decision to run in the first place. At the time, a lot of news outlets kind of reported that this was a mutual decision in some way, and her press secretary, Sheila Tate, kind of said that this was a decision they had kind of come to together, and obviously when he makes the announcement, she is there. But in reality, that was not necessarily the case. Obviously, Mrs. Reagan kind of had to be slightly persuaded. She really was not that keen that he run, again, especially because of the impact on his health. She worried terribly about him, and the assassination attempt that had already occurred on her husband's life in the first administration was something that she was deeply concerned about. I'm not sure how much of a dialogue it really was, but in the end, he does decide to run anyway, and it's portrayed as being this mutual decision. The second point is just how visible a role she plays. And you can see this especially in the Republican convention, which was held here in Dallas in August. Mrs. Reagan takes to the podium, and there's this sort of outpouring of warmth for her, which is widely documented in the news. And that appearance really kind of solidifies her centrality as a figure in this campaign. There's a really nice moment where they have this seemingly quite advanced for the 80s live stream where he is beamed in watching from the hotel, and she is waving up at him and he's waving back at her, and it's this kind of nice moment. And they show a film about her life where she is shown kind of meeting the Pope and meeting all of these world figures, and they talk about all of these good deeds that she's doing and what a great face of America she is out in the world, and why she should be kind of re-elected as First Lady. The next thing is this idea of Mrs. Reagan being her husband's protector, which is a really core image that we have of her. And this kind of was displayed in a number of different ways throughout the campaign. So also in August, she was seen kind of potentially giving her husband cues, whispering to herself on the platform behind him. And the press kind of reported that she was feeding him things. And there had been other instances of this happening, and this was all denied. But the thing that it did raise was this question of age. And obviously this was something that she also did work as his protector to kind of dispute and contest in the press. She gave these interviews where she would talk about how optimistic he was for the future and how he slept so soundly at night because he didn't worry, and really portraying not only the personal side of him as a human, but also kind of really shoring up this idea that he is the strong, optimistic choice for America. The other thing to mention about Mrs. Reagan as a protector was that when the first debate happened in October and it didn't go particularly well for President Reagan, she was absolutely furious with all of the aides, and she really kind of roasted them for this. And she thought that they had coached him too hard, and that it wasn't the best way for him to approach this. So she really did make her views known amongst the campaign team, certainly. The fourth point to touch on is a big one, which is abortion. Obviously, Mrs. Reagan was in stark contrast to Betty Ford, who had been Republican First Lady before her, who had been very pro-choice. Mrs. Reagan was, as Diane mentioned, on the pro-life end of the spectrum and kind of allied with courting the conservative religious right. But she also did come a bit unstuck with this during the campaign. She had an interview with the LA Times where they asked her if she believed in exemptions for cases of rape. And she kind of paused and said that she wasn't necessarily sure. And this resulted in a whole situation where Sheila Tate had to issue a response. And there were calls for her to clarify her position. But in actual fact, what Sheila Tate said was, Mrs. Reagan is not the candidate. She does not have to disclose her personal opinions. Some people would kind of contest that by saying that the First Lady is also on the ticket in some cases. So that was kind of an interesting instance, and certainly one where she was an important figure anyway. And then the final thing that I would say in terms of the practicalities of her campaigning, that links a lot to her initiatives that she championed, not only as First Lady, but also as First Lady of California. So we have the Just Say No anti-drugs program, and we also have the foster grandparent scheme. And what she would do when she was kind of campaigning on her own was go into schools, into small kind of community groups under the guise of these initiatives, where she could talk in very controlled environments to folks, and it would be documented by the press, and then that would be sent out there to the world. So she was kind of using her incumbent First Lady position to be able to do that and project. I guess it was just sort of a continuation of her doing the things that she was already doing as First Lady. So I will cut it there because there's lots more I could say. But I'm sure there are plenty of parallels to be drawn between 1984 and 2024 that we can talk about in the Q&A.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just thinking, compared to Jill Biden, as the protector. Thank you, Liz. That's fantastic. On then to Dr. Anthony Ames. I was the director of scholarly activities at the Ronald Reagan Institute. Courses most recently published on Reagan Thatcher, an excellent book which I've really enjoyed reviewing in a roundtable. And yeah, so perhaps Anthony could talk to us about the Anglo-American dimension of the '84 election, please.
Well, Jim, thanks for having me on, and it's great to see Andy and Elizabeth and Diane and Ewan. I'll be seeing you shortly next week in person, so it's a nice appetizer here in this roundtable. I'll speak a little bit about Anglo-American relations, and since our colleague Chris isn't with us today, maybe I'll veer into the Cold War a little bit, as one has to when talking about Anglo-American relations in the context of the '84 election. But I'll also kind of take a pointed approach to how I'll discuss these things like Elizabeth. The first thing I want to emphasize is the 1984 election begins in 1982. Not in the same way where we think about the political machinery that exists in the United States today of never-ending elections and the texts that we all get about donating to every single candidate day in and day out, various prop initiatives. It's really become quite something. But the strategy, the resolve, resilience, and the concerns about how to pursue a winning campaign in 1984 really begin in '82. And they begin in '82 because, as is the case with incumbents quite often in U.S. midterms, the president party loses a number of seats. They lose a number of seats on issues of the economy, and they lose a number of seats on issues of Reagan's handling of U.S.-Soviet relations, particularly the nuclear dimension and the arms race. So on economy and the arms race, of course, Thatcher and Reagan are in lockstep. I mean, these are two issues that the U.S. and the U.K. Really carry forward on together. I will not speculate as to whether Thatcher's economic program would have carried on without a political soulmate on the other side of the Atlantic carrying on a similar, though not identical, economic program. But certainly, if there was ever a time to reverse course and cut one's losses from a kind of ideological point of view for the Reagan administration, it would have been after the fall midterms in 1982. One of the big fault lines that emerges after 1982 is how are we to get across our views? Are we not really truly reaching the kind of moral center or the morally righteous electorate in America? Now, Diane has said, of course, religion did not play a big role by exit poll data, but the issue of morality and moral discussions, particularly around issues of life and death, capital punishment, abortion, and nuclear warfare did play a big role, right? And so where we start to see a kind of a more aggressive transatlantic Anglo-American framing of, say, the moral dimension of nuclear warfare, for example, comes in June 1982 at Westminster, in the famous Reagan Westminster address, where he lays out kind of a new program for defeating the Soviet Union, for confronting the Soviet Union, and frames it in staunchly moral language. If you read that speech alongside the 1983 speech that Reagan gives to the National Association of Evangelicals, they're strikingly similar. And it's basically a British version of Peace Through Strength in terms of the allusions to Britain's illustrious imperial history and Churchill and whatnot. Some of these references are just swapped in and out. So those moral dimensions really start to coalesce in a stronger way between the U.S. and the U.K. In the U.K., of course, you see Victorian virtues, right? Is a kind of resurgent under Thatcher. And that sense of Victorian virtues in the '83 British election as being an effective message in the context of kind of broader geopolitics strikes a note with U.S. strategists who are really concerned about the Thatcher government's chances of remaining in power at one point. So when they see that messaging prove to be successful in the '83 election, it kind of further greenlights the approach to Reagan's kind of moral approach in the '84 election. I should also note that today we see media in kind of global terms. Fox News and Sky News and the Wall Street Journal and the Times and any number of think tanks have quite a number of either loose or very tight connections. And in the 1980s, in the Reagan and Thatcher years, you really start to see that emerge in a more robust way than it had been throughout the kind of earlier Cold War period, 50s, 60s, and 70s. One of the best cases, for example, is the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is considered Reagan's think tank. They do not exactly have the kind of Reagan approach to geopolitics anymore as their marching order. But in the 1980s, it's considered the Reagan think tank. It emerges in 1973, first along the kind of economic front, thinking about ways to reinvigorate the U.S. economy, but it's a different type of think tank. It's not a think tank akin to Chatham House or Council on Foreign Relations or Brookings. It's really a policy-first advocacy think tank, kind of a move fast with sound clips sort of thing. And that think tank model is exported very successfully to the UK by the Heritage Foundation in the 1980s. And the back and forth, not just on the model, but on the fundraising side, for example, Ed Foldner, the president of the Heritage Foundation, goes out and raises quite a bit of money for British think tanks that are supporting conservatives. Really sees Britain as the eyes and ears for the Reagan administration in Europe. So those are a few things that strengthen the connections, particularly between the Conservative Party and the Republican Party, Reagan's Republican Party. There are, of course, connections between what we would call Democrats, who are kind of emerging into a progressive coalition, and a fractured Labour Party and some more progressive elements in the UK. But we're talking about a victorious 1984 Republican election, so I won't veer into those aspects. But one of the other things in terms of Anglo-American relations in the Cold War more generally that's important for the Reagan re-election is that the Thatcher government's willing to give Reagan space, right? So Thatcher's not too excited about Grenada, but she recognizes its importance for Reagan being able to cast himself as a strong leader, as an assertive leader, right? Thatcher's not too excited initially about the Strategic Defense Initiative, but she recognizes its importance for Reagan to wrestle the peace narrative away from the peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement in the United States. Thatcher's not too excited about economic sanctions in response to the pipeline crisis and the solidarity and martial law crisis in Poland. Very, very likely could have a direct impact, negative impact on Britain and European economies. But publicly, she gives space to Reagan on that, so he can continue to kind of consolidate that image of an assertive Cold War leader. And it's important. It's important because in the 1984 election, of course, Reagan wins almost 60% of the vote, 49 of the 50 states in the United States. It's a landslide, but there's actually two issues where Reagan does not beat Mondale on. And those two issues are foreign affairs and specifically the handling of the arms race. He cuts down the margin, but the successes of the Reagan administration's foreign policy, specifically regarding the Soviet Union, haven't emerged yet in 1983 and in 1984, right? You have a collapse in arms control away from the Soviet Union. You have, for example, real catastrophe in the Middle East, in the Israel-Lebanon war, with the bombing of Marine barracks in Beirut. You see some kind of terror issues pop up abroad. The Soviets continue to seem to be on the march. So the successes that we look back retrospectively on in foreign policy terms during the Reagan years really all come in quite rapid succession in the second term. It's a live question in the 1984 election if Reagan's strategy is going to play out. And so Thatcher's willingness to give space is really a key part of that political relationship.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Again, just prompting my thoughts, my thinking, and yeah, really thank you, and thank you for covering for Chris as well there, and adding some more general Cold War material. They're really helpful. On then to perhaps to wrap up the opening remarks to Professor Ewan Morgan, who's of course our most eminent scholar over here of presidential studies in the UK. If I could just try to allow camera, and then you'll Ewan, can you are you with us? You can talk about the legacy of 1994.
Okay, wait a minute.
Anyway, oh no.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Ewan, I think it's you're still. There's two of you, Ewan, in the meeting.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to get rid of it.
Okay, let me. Okay, I can't remove you. Let me. Mute myself. Oh, if I. Right, let me go to people. Ewan Morgan. Attendees, Ewan Morgan. Remove from meeting. Okay, is that better, Ewan?
Absolutely, yes. Can you hear me?
There you go. I'll kick the other Ewan out. Sorry, Ewan. Don't take it personally. Okay, so yeah, over to you and talk about the legacy then of the 84 election, please, Ewan.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I'll keep my remarks brief and hope that the echo factor doesn't cut me off. I'm going to talk about three things about the 1984 election for the Ronald Reagan legacy. I think, first of all, Ronald Reagan's victory by a landslide consolidated low taxes as a staple element of America's political culture. As we know, in promoting the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, Reagan perpetrated the greatest shake-up of the federal tax system since the income tax became a mass tax in 1942. The IRTA, as it was known, may have principally benefited the rich. They got the biggest benefits out of it. But everybody got something out of IRTA. Every income group that paid taxes got something out of IRTA. Even that said, of course, its permanence was by no means guaranteed because the Democrats tried to use it to argue that the tax giveaways of 1981 were responsible for driving the budget deficit into the stratosphere. In fiscal 1983, the US deficit crossed the 200 billion mark for the first time in history. It doesn't sound very much then, but it sent shockwaves through the corridors of Washington and the White House, indeed, at the time. And early in 1983, opinion polls showed that the public was willing to sacrifice the last tranche of the income tax cuts, which had been given in three tranches on an annual basis. And the public opinion poll showed the public willing to give up the final tranche in the hope of controlling the deficit, which they feared would reignite inflation to the levels of the late 70s. But the Democrats, that mode didn't last, particularly as the economy went into recovery, very strong recovery in mid-1983, a recovery which continued through to the election and beyond. The Democrats made the strategic error of making the deficit one of the core issues of their 1984 campaign by promising that they would get the deficit under control by reducing it by 2/3 in the next 4 years if they were elected to the White House, and they would do this by raising taxes. Now, the public soon discovered that Mondale's plan to cut the deficit through tax increases involved hiking taxes on the middle class as well as the rich, and that went down like a lead balloon as far as they were concerned. It made Mondale's defeat almost inevitable. But I think it also ensured that no future presidential candidate would risk advocating substantial tax cuts in order to get the deficit under control. And that has made it very difficult for the United States to close the fiscal gap. It made it very difficult for the United States to close the fiscal gap, with the exception, of course, of the unusual final years of the Clinton presidency, when the boom on Wall Street created a short-lived revenue harvest. Okay, secondly, I think that the 1984 election was a retrospective verdict on Reagan's first term, rather than a mandate for an expanded conservatism in his second term. In this regard, it was very similar, I think, to the 1936 presidential election that FDR won by a landslide. Above all, it was a vote of thanks for the conquest of inflation that had been running at 13% in 1980. Of course, it was the Federal Reserve that had brought inflation down, but Ronald Reagan got the political credit, and perhaps deservedly so, because he had taken the heat for the recessionary consequences of the Fed's monetary strategy in 1981 to 2. I think that success established the Republican Party long-term as the party best able to deal with inflation, a reputation perhaps consolidated in the outcome of the 2024 election. Finally, I think the 1984 vote was also an endorsement, despite, I agree that Mondale, the only areas where Mondale was ahead of Reagan in terms of superior leadership as far as opinion polls were concerned, was in foreign policy. But I think the outcome was an endorsement ultimately of Reagan's peace through strength approach to the Soviet Union. The public, of course, was very fearful that the growth of superpower tensions and confrontation in the early 1980s would lead to nuclear war at some point. But it still remained trusting of Reagan to follow through on peace through strength. The Democrats offered a peace through talking alternative, but it didn't get them anywhere in terms of the vote. Reagan's landslide victory, he got a 58% share, gave him a solid base to continue with his peace through strength strategy in the second term. And of course, he had the benefit in the second term. 3 Soviet leaders, old hardline Soviet leaders, that died in his first term. Mikhail Gorbachev is just about to come on the scene, and he and Reagan strike up a new partnership in moving the two countries to a new détente. So quite interesting. 1983 has gone down in history as the year of living dangerously, ends with the Able Archer exercise, NATO exercise, which the Soviets feared would be a cover for a first strike by the United States. It was nothing of the kind, of course, but it was indicative of the level of fear and tension that existed in 1983. So we moved from 1983 through to 1987, 1988, the establishment of a new détente that lays the foundation for the end of the Cold War on terms largely favorable to the United States. And I would say that ending of the Cold War was Reagan's greatest legacy to the United States and the world. So I'll end there.
Thank you. And I mean, as Anthony mentioned about the Westminster speech course, Reagan said that the Cold War could end, that this bipolar world wasn't forever, and everyone thought he was mad. But obviously, it was his greatest legacy, perhaps. Okay, so I thank you, and that's a fantastic wrapping up for the initial opening remarks. So I've got all sorts of scribbles. Longer just kind of supposed to ask a general question that's going to just kick off the discussions. Please do kind of, talk among yourselves, ask connections with each other, and we'll try and find time as well for any Q&A from the audience. If they want to put anything in the Q&A function, we'll try and feed that into the discussion as well. So I'm sure you've got your own ideas, questions, and comments you want to ask of each other. But for me, I think the story, the connection running through this, words like incumbency, battle of ideas, the economy, all seem to be kind of some common threads. And is this, in terms of the social issues, the moral issues like religion and so on, and all the anti-Reagan type social issues, was that all about perhaps mitigating problems, or basically if you don't do them, it's a problem? But the main story is the economy. So a bit like over here is that the Tories are desperate to kind of close the gap on the NHS. Like, they're never going to win on the NHS, but they want to kind of like make sure that it's not as bad as it could be. It's a bit like the idea of peace in the Cold War, peace through strength, rather than sort of talk about peace more rather than evil empire and so on, and try to narrow the gap. So in some way, did Reagan win this because of incumbency, and he was incumbent as the ideas, which were in the battle of ideas, seems to be winning, and that was more important than the social issues? Was that really key? Or is a case that we can't really prove a negative about ruling out any kind of social issues? Anthony?
And to be clear, I guess we should just use the raise a hand function. Is that probably the best way to go? Or you're muted, but I'll take that as a thumbs up. One thing we didn't mention is it's morning again in America. And anyone studying the 1984 election, from the junior high student in the United States to the graduate student in U.S. politics in the UK, either has heard that phrase, or better yet, has seen the commercial video on YouTube. And I say this to someone who thinks that Reagan was an incredibly gifted politician, but also the bar for the presidency was pretty low in 1980 and 1984. You had not had a full two-term president since Eisenhower. Kennedy, of course, would have liked to go a little differently. Johnson flames out dramatically in his decision not to run because of the Vietnam War. Obviously, Nixon is a pox on the office of the presidency, very much lowers the Americans' esteem of the office. Ford is seen as a gatekeeper, and Carter is seen as really one who embraces narratives of decline, whether or not that's actually true. But the probably one thing that most history students, American history students, know about Jimmy Carter is the crisis and confidence speech. So the bar is really low, and Reagan's ability to simply restore faith in the office of the presidency is incredibly important. That's restored through really strong assertions of U.S. leadership in places like NATO. It's restored through just this incredibly determined and persistent references and rhetorical investments in American patriotism and pride. not necessarily nativism and nationalism, but patriotism and pride in a kind of positive spin. Of course, his opponents would say otherwise, but I wouldn't go that far, given how we've seen nativism has played out in American politics, not just today, but throughout its history, right? It can have a lot harder edges, a lot uglier edges, and so the social issues, whether or not they played such a major role, let me borrow a term that we heard a lot around U.S. politics today. It was a lot more of a vibe election than people actually give it credit for, right? And it's a term that isn't perhaps academically precise, but nevertheless has some purchase. Jim, I'll leave it to you to decide who goes next, but I know Diane has her hand up.
Yes, please. Thank you, Anthony. Yeah. Morning America. Just to add, I hum that theme tune so often. It's one of those like it's like an earworm. Yeah. And the students love them. Whenever I show them to students, it's I think really kind of it's a masterclass in campaigning. Diane, and then Andy.
Thank you. My sense is that Reagan himself was not as enamored with the social issues as he was with the economic issues. In fact, I think he was fine backburnering the social issues. But I also think that he considered the economic issues as moral issues and religious issues. I think he really did believe that cutting taxes was a flip side of getting rid of welfare. And we know that he deeply opposed welfare because not only was it a drag on the economy, but it stripped people of their autonomy and their sense of personal responsibility. I make the case in my book that Reagan basically put a religious sheen on neoliberalism, which allowed it to be more palatable for many Americans who would not necessarily bought into the market-based economics and politics, which have come to determine our society at this point. So I think making a hard division between Reagan's moral religious sense and his political economic perspectives is not really doing full justice. And I think that occurs often because of the way religion is covered by the media in this country. If you think about what really drove the '84 election, which was the economy and the resurgence of American international viability, that was there, but religion took a really big place in that election, even if it wasn't really a determinative factor in how people voted. And I think that's because the media finds religion or thinks of religion as a topic which is a hot button topic and gets people clicking and reading. And for that reason, and it's the media's take on religion has never been particularly sophisticated. So the fact that Reagan didn't go to church enabled critics to say, oh, he wasn't religious, whereas I would argue his religion was interwoven into his policies. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Diane. I think that's really helpful. Andy, I think you were next, then you, and then Elizabeth, and back to Anthony.
Right. Well, I would agree with Diane about the connection between Reagan's religious views and economic issues, and I would go a step further and say that connection was also true of his view of foreign policy. I think his very deep anti-communism was substantially rooted in his religious views. And so I think that's all true. I think, getting back to Anthony's point of the vibe, I I think there's a lot to that. There was a vibe, and the vibe was, if you wanted to put one word to it, was renewal, right? The notion was the economy is coming back, the U.S. is coming back abroad, but there were a lot of Americans who were also worried about social trends and things that they think had gone wrong since the 1960s in terms of, whether it was crime or drugs or explosion of pornography or whatever. There were a number of abortion, of course, a number of issues that were there that a lot of Americans saw as a kind of indicative of decline. And I think it's right that Reagan did not put a high priority on those issues, but I do think that he agreed with them. I don't think he was being simply disingenuous by embracing, for example, school prayer, even though he didn't believe it because it might help him get votes. I think he believed it. It just was not, to his mind, at the higher level of priority. And that was true from the very beginning. If you see, there were folks in the religious right saying, you should have led with school prayer and abortion right out of the gate. And Reagan was not going to do that. He saw the economy as being the primary challenge, foreign policy, particularly dealing with the Soviets, as being right up there with the economy. And the other issues, not as high a priority.
Thank you, Andy. Again, really interesting. I'm having a great time. Ewan.
Yeah, a couple of things. Well, first of all, I think without a shadow of a doubt, what got Ronald Reagan into the White House in 1980 was the economy, the wretched state of the economy, 13% inflation, 7% unemployment, misery index of 20%. All the exit polls are consistent in that regard. So, by 1984, things are very much better. It's not simply the economy. I think it is a sense of America's back, better, stronger, so on. And, if you have Grenada as a demonstration of the new spirit in America to project itself abroad. If you look across the pond to Britain, Thatcher also wins a landslide election in 1983, not simply in the wake of the Falklands conflict, but also in the sense that the Conservative government has conquered inflation, begun to control the unions, which was seen as having far too much power in the 1970s. And there is that sense of very much of national renewal in Thatcher's Britain and Ronald Reagan's America. I think it's led by the economy, but I don't think it is simply about the economy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in the past people put a lot of perhaps over-egg the idea that it was the Falklands War that won it for Thatcher in '83. I think it was the improving economy, that broader narrative. I think for me behind her win. Elizabeth, sorry, over to you. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with this idea of, obviously it's accepted that the economy was so important, and obviously with the First Lady, she is a symbolic figure. She is not making economic policy. But there are kind of intersections where she does meet these issues. So obviously in the first term, she is not kind of seen as being a widely popular figure and makes a few mistakes in terms of the timing of the announcements that she makes. She purchases expensive china for the White House, and that comes in the same week that there's an announcement that ketchup is like considered a vegetable on school meals. And all of these kinds of just like mistimings, and she was sort of generally seen as being extravagant in the first term, and then obviously as the economy improves, and she also simultaneously improves her relationship with the press. You have the gridiron skit famously, but I think by this point she is kind of seen as restoring a glamour to the White House that is Kennedy-esque, which I think very much ties in with this discussion of it being morning in America again, and was something that is actually kind of like a lasting legacy of hers. And so it's interesting how, even though she is not involved in making economic policy, right? What she does clearly links to that and kind of mirrors that. Also, I would say on social issues and whether social issues really drove this, that's kind of difficult. And, you know, Mrs. Reagan herself kind of was pitching herself as this pro-life figure. That was not necessarily the case in reality. Those were not necessarily her own personal views, which kind of, we'll find out about that much later on after her husband has left the White House, but it's about this courting of this moral social vote, right? I also think in terms of abortion, there's something that I have seen from my kind of recent research seems to be an interesting shift in that when you look at previous elections and first ladies discussing abortion, particularly in the 70s, it seems to be discussed as if it's a woman's issue, and it's talked about amongst the female press corps and on the women's sheets of newspapers, where first ladies are kind of expected to answer for the women's issues on the ticket, and so abortion kind of seemed to fall under that remit. So in the 70s, you get like, you know, like when President Reagan challenged Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination in the 70s, you know, you have Betty Ford at one end of the spectrum saying, I completely support women's rights, I support the ERA. And then you have Nancy Reagan saying, I don't think the ERA is necessary. And they're kind of pitted against one another as these competing kind of conceptions of female leadership on the ticket. But then I think by the time we get to 1984, abortion really moves from being a woman's issue into being a broader social and moral issue, as has kind of been mentioned, particularly tying in with the religious elements of the campaign and the courting of the religious right. So I think there are some kind of fundamental, in terms of abortion, some fundamental redrawings of the battle lines that are happening there. But first ladies occupy this very liminal space where they are sort of like part of the campaign, but they're also not necessarily on the ticket. So it's kind of like difficult to say for sure how they kind of fit into that. And also in terms of her, you mentioned incumbency, that's something that we haven't necessarily spoken about, but she kind of talks about how in her, if you read My Turn, there's like a tiny section where she talks about the 1984 election. It's really not that long at all. And she just says, you know, like we didn't really have that long to campaign. It wasn't as drawn out a process as previous cycles. So I think that was a huge factor in terms of the fact that she didn't necessarily change anything that she was doing, particularly in terms of going out and campaigning. I'll leave it there. There's plenty of stuff that we can talk about.
Thank you very yeah. Thank you. I've never actually read My Turn, to my shame. Clearly I should. Okay. Anthony, and then Ewan, please.
So on this issue of social issues and how important they were, I think all my colleagues kind of have it right that Reagan waved to a lot of these issues. He dealt with them not in a comprehensive, robust manner. There's a couple concrete examples that I'll share. The first is the appointment of C. Everett Koop to the office of Surgeon General. I'll note I was a reviewer for a new biography coming out on Koop, I believe with the University of Massachusetts Press, and it's phenomenal. And I have a lot more appreciation for the complexity of his character and his career. But the Surgeon General was a backwater, nothing, post in 1981. It is seen as a concession to the pro-life movement, but it's not seen as a real victory. The Surgeon General has no real formal powers. The powers that the Surgeon General once had been subsumed by other offices and agency heads. So it's really minimal, and Koop is ultimately able to remake that office, its influence and its impact. And so, on the balance, when Reagan goes out of office, Koop with him, it seems like, oh my goodness, what a appointment with great foresight, clearly a major gift to evangelicals and social conservatives and movement conservatives, but it really wasn't at the time. The second is Reagan pens this, Reagan and his aides penned this little booklet or article in 83, 84, Abortion in the Conscience of a Nation. And, you know, there's a couple different ways to take that. It's not like Reagan really pursued an abortion amendment or any really serious legislative or executive action on the matter, but writing his thoughts down on it is seen as, again, waving to that social conservative kind of constituency, appealing to that social conservative constituency without actually kind of making good on the policies that might alienate other parts of his broad voter base, right? The second thing I want to make, the second point I want to make actually is a compliment to those who were trained in British academia on how they view Reagan on social issues. You know, it strikes me that in all the different project proposals I read about Ronald Reagan and all the books I've read about Ronald Reagan and articles, British students, particularly, you know, British students who come up with a perhaps more thorough and deeper understanding of class politics as just kind of a natural component of you know, your nation's kind of academic culture, seem to get the 80s right in a way that American students often don't, because of the obsession with kind of these social issues, gender, race, religion. Those things are important, but they're not all-consuming. They don't explain everything. And so Diane mentioned that, you know, Reagan saw the social issues through the lens of economic policy and dimensions. I think that's absolutely right. You know, for example, there's a new book on Reagan in the South. Jonathan Bardo, who I believe might have been Ewan's student, if I have my memory correct, really centers the economic dimension in the Reagan's engagement with the South, the kind of anti-statist, right, rather than the racial aspects. And that's something that I think U.S.-based and trained historians could learn from our British counterparts.
Thank you, Matt. That's definitely something a book to look out for. Ewan, over to you, please.
Oh, thanks. Just on Jonathan Bartho, yes, he was my PhD student, and his book on has just come out with University Press of Kansas. A terrific book, in my humble opinion. But the point I was going to make was, you know, we're somehow freeze-framed around about 1984. And I just wonder whether we also ought to be thinking about what the elections signified for Reagan's second term. And it's my belief, be interested to hear other people's views, second terms for presidents rarely go as well as the first term. One thinks of FDR, one thinks of Dwight Eisenhower, one thinks of Richard Nixon, most obviously, and you think of Reagan. Yes, it ends in the great achievement of the INF Treaty of 1987, but on the way to that, you know, you have Reagan's domestic politics in the second term, very much dominated by an effort to get control of the budget. Reagan's own Republican Party begins to take an independent line. Reagan finds himself having to defend his defense increases and his tax cuts to ensure that they are not given away in any kind of deal to control the budget, which he succeeds in doing. So that's one thing, but it's a defensive action. The second thing, he brought up Everett Koop. Of course, Everett Koop produced this report on the great humanitarian and health crisis of the 1980s on AIDS, and he advocated a campaign of education to urge people, young people in particular, about the dangers of unprotected sex. This is exactly what happened in the UK when Margaret Thatcher's administration promoted the "Don't Die of Ignorance" campaign, and they had a massive public campaign urging people, warning people of the dangers of unprotected sexual relations, whether it was heterosexual or homosexual. But of course, the Coop report doesn't really get the kind of support it needed from the president, because people in the administration say, no, we can't have this. We can't have the advocate. We can't go advocating that premarital sex is okay. We've got to have a moral approach to it. That's the best way of combating AIDS. And of course, this is getting, even while Reagan is winning his massive re-election, he's getting deeper and deeper into the Iran conflict scandal, which could have led to impeachment. It didn't, but it could have. Reagan's second term, yes, it ends with a great success, but the annus mirabilis of the Reagan presidency, I would argue, is 1981. It's a hard road defending what was achieved then, and that road becomes even more difficult in the second term. I'd be interested to see if people agree with me, or whether they think I'm talking nonsense from a transatlantic perspective.
No, I know Dan's going to come in, but I agree. I think I see 84 as very much like the high point, or like the final kind of victory, if you will, of that first term team. Because of the first term, you have the Troika, you have Baker, you have Mies, you have Diva, and of course, come after 84, Mies has gone on to be Attorney General, Baker's gone into Treasury Secretary, Don Regan's came in, and it's not at all as effective as Chief of Staff, and Diva's sort of on his way out as well. Really, he's gone within a couple of years too. So, I think that 84 is a referendum on the incumbency, the ideas of Reaganism, restoring the faith in the office again. In some way, the seeds of the problems of the second term have been sown by some of the departures and some of the events happening in the background, like you were saying, Ewan. So I think there's a lot to say about that as well. Diane, and then Andy, please.
We've talked a lot about Everett Koop, but I want to mention another one of Reagan's appointees who I think is interesting, especially in retrospect, and that's Sandra Day O'Connor. As we all know, O'Connor was the first female to be on the Supreme Court. She proved to be a swing vote in many ways. She was pretty much anathema to the religious conservatives who backed him. And I think that's another example of how non-doctrinaire Reagan was in certain ways, and also of his ability to think outside the box in ways that sort of flummoxed both his supporters and his opponents. I personally would pick 1983 as an important and key year for the administration, since that's a year when Reagan went from being almost seemingly unelectable in January because of his very low ratings, to being the white knight on a white steed by December, because the recovery may have started in 82, but most Americans didn't really start feeling it till the summer of 83. 83 was also the year when we went into Grenada, which, as everyone has said, was a really pivotal moment in terms of restoring America's national pride. It's also the year when Reagan really took on the freeze movement, and I would say in many ways bested them by the end of it. And he also, depending upon who you read, has had his own come to Jesus moment after seeing the day after. So economically, politically, he didn't really get any big social wins that I can think of in '83. But to me, that was a year that was most that was a high point of the presidency, and it was way before he got entangled in all the Iran-Contra stuff later on. So that would be my vote.
Thank you, Diane. Just remind some people in the who are watching us, you can put in questions in the Q&A box or the chat and so on. Just over to Andy then, please.
Sure, thanks. So thinking about the second term and its relation to the election of 1984, there were things that Reagan got through in his second. You know, there were problems. Obviously, Iran-Contra is probably the biggest problem that he faced. There were other problems. There were a lot of diplomatic successes, but there were some domestic successes that we haven't really talked about. One of them being the tax reform, excuse me, the Tax Reform Act in 1986, which was really a bipartisan measure, but it, as Ewan mentioned, it preserved the basic idea of low individual tax rates, but it also flattened the tax system quite a bit. So the top rate was only 28%. That was something Reagan had wanted. He had been talking about it in the election. He kind of offloaded it to the Treasury Department and then Congress to work it out. But the end product was something that he found very, amenable to his overall goals. There was also a welfare reform measure that passed when he was almost out of office. It was 1988, and it was not, did not go as far as he wanted to go, but it, in some ways, set a kind of precedent for the much more serious welfare reform in 1996. So there were some things that happened, but I absolutely agree that it was not, it was not like the first term. It was not like the first year, certainly. I think, a lot of folks who have looked at this would argue, and I don't think they're wrong, that part of this had to do with the way he ran his 1984 campaign, that it was precisely because it was a very retrospective campaign, and his the folks running his campaign were really hoping for a 50-state sweep. The way to do it was Morning in America. It was not a more hard-nosed kind of drive to add seats in Congress on the basis of a more specific kind of program for the second term. And so Republicans did gain about a dozen seats in the House, which is pretty modest. And they actually lost a couple seats in the Senate in 1984. So there was, an unchanged Congress basically, and not a whole lot of sense after 1984 that if you were in Congress, you owed a lot to Reagan, or that he could hurt you in any particular way. But a lot of members of Congress feared that after 1980. Because there were big coattails in 1980. But after 1984, that sense was not there as much, which helps explain why, Republican senators, for example, kind of strayed from Reagan's preferences when it came to some of the budget questions and things like that.
Thank you, Andy. Just before I bring Elizabeth back in, I was just wondering if any of you guys, after Elizabeth has spoken, got any thoughts about the Democrats and all this? Did they just simply not get Reagan, understand Reagan, had not learned his lessons from 1980? Was it inevitable that they lose since they get Mondale as a nominee as Carter's VP? Was that inevitable? Were they just simply unable to get to grips any potential weaknesses of Reagan as well in terms of a potential age issue and so on? But anyway, Elizabeth.
On mute. So just hanging on from Ewan's kind of question, I kind of already touched a little bit on how the first term Nancy Reagan had some kind of PR problems. Those kind of get ironed out. And in terms of the second term looking forwards, I just kind of wanted to point to this kind of idea of a consolidation of her own power. By the end, not necessarily something that's viewed as a good thing always. It's a question of how much power is too much power for a first lady to have, which is a really enduring question. You know, she kind of from 1985 onwards is sort of pushing for a summit with Soviet leaders, and for Reagan to kind of sit down and talk with them. So she is kind of playing a really key behind the scene roles in terms of that. And obviously when Gorbachev comes to DC in 87, I think she like organizes the social events for that, and kind of plays a key role, and this is kind of apocryphally summed up by Gromyko saying, you know, to whisper peace in your husband's ear every night, and she says, yeah, and I'll whisper it in yours too. And I think that is kind of like a real image of this soft power that first ladies have, that seem to have just been like really shored up under Nancy Reagan. Like, you know, it's usual that that first ladies have some kind of soft power, but I think it's almost like a step that much further. And obviously this idea that she is like the power behind the throne is like really kind of entrenched by the end of the administration, particularly in terms of her role in staffing and personnel decisions. And, you know, when she kind of has a fallout with Donald Reagan, and his book that comes out kind of exposes this idea that she's consulting astrologers in the White House. You know, you can't talk about Nancy Reagan and not talk about Joan Quigley and the astrology kind of connections there. So, you know, I think her status as like this Republican queen is really solidified in the second term, for good or ill, either side. Talking about the Democrats kind of briefly, on the flip side of that, you know, Rosalind Carter re-wore her dress that she wore for the gubernatorial inauguration for her husband's White House inauguration, and they were sort of turning the lights off in the White House, and she was seen as this very much like hardcore working woman who kind of reorganized the East Wing office, which is a whole other story. But Nancy Reagan was obviously a very marked difference from that, and I think that Joan Mondale was probably just, you know, tainted by association for a start. And also, you know, she kind of also got into a bit of bother in the campaigning because she said that she wasn't going to kind of like do teas and do the traditional thing. And then she ended up writing a cookbook because they had to kind of backpedal on that. So I think in Joan Mondale, she was facing it was like a very clear choice in terms of different conceptions of American womanhood and which mother and spouse in chief you kind of wanted in the White House in that election. She also said that she was going to campaign the arts, and she was going to, you know, further the arts as kind of her project in the White House. And I wonder if, yeah, maybe that was because the arts is kind of historically something that first ladies do, and they do kind of go in saying that. But I wonder if by this point, that wasn't necessarily enough of a promise of what she was going to do. But then again, Nancy Reagan wasn't necessarily going, and, you know, obviously she had the foster grandparents kind of program, and those were sort of like entrenched social issues that she was already kind of working on. So I'm not too sure on that. And maybe, you know, there's a broader discussion to be had here in terms of the decline of the women's movement and the failure to ratify the ERA, which was obviously something that Joan Mondale was like well and truly aligned with at that point. So I think it was, you know, it's a firm rejection of that, certainly. There are people far more qualified to talk about the Democrats, though, at this point, so I'm going to relinquish the floor.
Thank you, Liz. I think you make some really interesting, really thoughtful comments about, you know, the broader story here, about the women's movement and so on. I'm just conscious I've got about 8 minutes left, so perhaps ask Anthony, then Andy, then Ewan. and then we'll have to bring this to a close. Unfortunately, I could do this all night, or do this all day, as Captain America would say. So yes, over to Ansi, then Andy, and then you, and then I think we'll have to bring our discussion to a close. To take more of your time. So yeah, over to Ansi, please.
Yeah, Jim, I'll just spike the football. Since we're talking American politics, I'll talk American sports here. I'll spike the football on Elizabeth's comments. I mean, 1984 for Democrats is gender gap, gender gap, gender gap, gender gap. And in some ways, it's similar to 2024 in that regard, where gender gap politics probably put some blinders on Democrats heading into the election. They really think the advantage is with women. Obviously, the Ferrara vote or a point, or I should say ticket, is key to that. But one of the reasons I would argue that the gender gap becomes so prominent in Democratic strategists' mind is because they're searching for ways to rebuild a coalition that's collapsed. In American politics, you basically see this flux where one party seems to have tightly coupled its coalition or its big tent, and the other party's big tent or coalition seems to be kind of unraveling or unwinding or loosening. And so for Democrats in the 1980s, you see Catholics starting to increasingly move toward Reagan. You see the labor vote shift toward Reagan in a way that was surprising. Andy surely has something to say on that, given his recent very, very good book on the PATCO strike. You see even kind of, Hispanics aren't that big of a population group. Latinos aren't that big of a population group in the United States in the 1980s, certainly as they are now. But even Latinos vote for Reagan in fairly high numbers and percentages, as opposed to Democrats. And part of that, again, is the Democrats don't know what their coalition is. So if we center it within the nuclear freeze movement, for example, which is certainly the area where the Democrats have the most stock of, say, organizing and grassroots muscle, you have these kind of odd bedfellows with the women's movement and the Catholic Church, which had, of course, previously been lined up on opposite ends on Roe v. Wade, right, and on the abortion issue. Labor, you have people like Lane Kirkland, head of the AFL-CIO, real staunch cold warrior, actively suppressing some more political activities from labor unions who want to be more aggressively in support of kind of anti-nuclear or peace movement attacks on Reagan's record during the campaign. This coalition just doesn't have a reason for being yet. It doesn't have a purpose yet. And perhaps one of the biggest indicators of this is Jesse Jackson's run for the presidency in the 80s, right? He sees this opportunity to seize and realize a new Democratic Party in a way that, even though he's not the first African-American to run for president, in a way that I think African Americans hadn't before. I'll yield then to, of course, Andy and Ewan.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yes, I would not say too much on it. You raised the question: Did Democrats not get Reagan? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think they didn't get him when he was in California. They thought that he was an aberration when he won the governorship of California, and then when he won in 1980, they thought he was an aberration. And I think the whole Democratic race for the Democratic nomination in 1984 was partly about this question: what is our coalition going to be? And Mondale was the candidate of the old Democratic coalition, the very labor-oriented Democratic coalition. And Gary Hart presented himself as someone who was going to build this new coalition that would be more technocratic, more based in younger voters and so on. and Mondale won that contest, you could say. But I would say that Hart would be more comfortable in the contemporary Democratic Party than Mondale would be.
Thank you, Andy. And Ewan, I think last word to you, please.
Okay, well, just looking at transatlantic connections, it's often been remarked that Margaret Thatcher's greatest legacy for British politics was Tony Blair. In other words, New Labour had to come into being because old Labour had been shown to be irrelevant in the Thatcher era. I wonder if you can make the same comment about not Reagan's greatest legacy, but one of his most important legacies was Bill Clinton. You know, the New Democrats of the 1990s, who now recognize that the old New Deal style liberalism doesn't work anymore. And it is significant, I think, that immediately after the crushing defeat of 1984, moderate to conservative Democrats formed the Democratic Leadership Council, which of course is an attempt to get a Southerner into the White House, and that eventually succeeds with Bill Clinton, who can take on the Republicans without the baggage of big government, of liberal big government. I'll end there.
Okay. Thank you all. I think that's our time. I'm going to go and do some daddy duty now. But thank you all very much for your time. Thank you for your contributions. Tilly Ross is a student researcher attached to this project as well now. So the plan is Tilly's going to help us put together the transcript and so on to be submitted hopefully for publication. But obviously we'll keep you all in the loop, keep posted about that. But Anthony, you best luck at your event next week in London. And unfortunately I can't attend. But best luck. Sure be a humdinger. And all of you, thank you ever so much for all you've done. So I've had a fantastic time, and clearly that's all really matters. But I wish you all the very best, and I'll be in touch soon about next steps.